this essay, Notes of a Native Son, is part of a collection that was published, I believe it's 1954. And I think maybe this essay was written maybe like 1953 or something. So this is like before like the civil rights movement really went like truly mainstream. And it's just kind of very useful to see what people were thinking, right? Not only in the 50s, but also, what black people were thinking, like going backwards into the 40s, because much of this has to do with James Baldwin's upbringing, the kinds of things that he saw and felt, and the lessons that it had for him now as an adult in his like early 30s, writing this essay, or this book of essays rather. And I said this before when we went over James Baldwin's take on Birth of a Nation. Right, he's an excellent writer. At his best, he's a truly great writer. Probably a better essayist than he was a novelist. But the thing that I like most about his essays is just the fact that it might as like some of it might as well be like a first person narrator in a novel somewhere, right? In fact, if you take like some of his like kind of more racial books or whatever, there's like you could just imagine some characters going through this or saying something like this, and it would read just as well, right? I mean, it shouldn't necessarily add gravitas simply because we know that James Baldwin had the experiences that he's going to describe here, right? That this might as well have been fiction in some ways, and it would have still captured the same amount of reality as he captures here, because as Dan pointed out before, right? When it comes to truth versus reality, right? Truth is always like what happens, right? But what happens isn't as interesting, at least to me, compared to like the underpinning kind of reality, right? Which is the thing that is never truly in flux. It's not a coincidence that when it comes to like descriptions of slave life or the logic of slavery, Mark Twain with Huckleberry Finn did so much more, in describing what that must have felt like than, tons and tons of like first person narratives might have done. Of course, they would have focused on different things, but anyway, underlying reality is something that shouldn't be ignored. Let me see. Was there anything else by way of introduction here that I wanted to say? I guess the thing will speak for itself. I mean, it's good enough to be able to do that. So, Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. On the 29th of July in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. Over a month before this, while all our energies were concentrated in waiting for these events, there had been in Detroit one of the bloodiest race riots of the century. A few hours after my father's funeral, while he lay in state in the Undertaker's chapel, a race riot broke out in Harlem. On the morning of the 3rd of August, we drove my father to the graveyard through a wilderness of smashed plate glass. So before we go any further, I mean, just think about how effective this kind of setup is, right? This is supposed to be kind of like at the beginning, it seems like it might be a little essay about his experiences with his father's death. Then it, transitions into a child being born, and of course, the combination has sort of like poetic consequences there. But the rest of the paragraph just focuses on the historical context, right? I mean, Baldwin knew as he was writing this that this was relevant, right? As he was experiencing it, he must have felt that the fact that these events somehow existed in time, perhaps I could go deeper, right, and find some underlying connections between these events that go beyond merely existing and happening contemporaneously. The day of my father's funeral had also been my 19th birthday. As we drove him to the graveyard, the spoils of injustice, anarchy, discontent, and hatred were all around us. It seemed to me that God himself had devised, to mark my father's end, the most sustained and brutally dissonant of all codas, And it seemed to me, too, that the violence which rose all about us as my father left the world had been devised as a corrective for the pride of his eldest son. I had declined to believe in that apocalypse which had been central to my father's vision. Very well, life seemed to be saying, here is something that will certainly pass for an apocalypse until the real thing comes along. I had inclined to be contemptuous of my father for the conditions of his life, for the conditions of our lives. When his life had ended, I began to wonder about that life and also, in a new way, to be apprehensive about my own. I had not known my father very well. We had got on badly, partly because we shared, in our different fashions, the vice of stubborn pride. When he was dead, I realized that I had hardly ever spoken to him. When he had been dead a long time, I began to wish I had. It seems to be typical of life in America, where opportunities, real and fancied, are thicker than anywhere else on the globe, that the second generation has no time to talk to the first. No one, including my father, seems to have known exactly how old he was, but his mother had been born during slavery. He was of the first generation of free men. He, along with thousands of other Negroes, came north after 1919, and I was part of that generation which had never seen the landscape of what Negroes sometimes call the old country. I remember when I read this, I reread again recently, like a couple days ago, preparing for the stream, and a couple things stood out. First of all, let's look at this line. It seems to be typical of life in America, where opportunities, real and fancied, are thicker than anywhere else on the globe, that the second generation has no time to talk to the first. This might have seemed a little bit revolutionary to James Baldwin, right? Because I mean, he was sort of presiding over kind of like one of the biggest expansions of wealth in all of human history, right? And of course, like since that time, it has expanded, not in an equitable way by any means, but it has expanded, right? It just went into the wrong hands. But this is kind of true, like of all generations, right? Isn't it? I mean, if you assume, for the most part, some kind of trajectory, some kind of progress, right? Some sort of, change in states, right? And people's like material conditions, like at least in some ways, this kind of happens all the time, right? I mean, he ascribes it to America's opportunities, right? Real and fancied. He ascribes this to those changes, right? But at the same time, like this is applicable even to today, right? The second generation has no time to talk to the first. Every single generation has something new, right? Which seems in some ways like an advantage. I think a lot of kids growing up today, might perceive some of what they have and feel as advantages, and who knows if they're still going to feel that way a decade or two from now. But this seems to be kind of like a human universal. The second part I want to point out is just the fact that I wanted to do the MLK speech, and I wanted to do this because you should never allow history, right, to just be. I thought Cookie was here. You should never allow history to just be abstract and remote from you, right? I mean, you should always sort of imagine how people behaved. Was it similar to you? Was it different from you? How that would have looked like? And I realized reading this that I didn't quite ever. I always like to imagine, lives and situations and what things could be or have been or will be. And I never really thought about this, right? So he says, he, along with thousands of other Negroes, came north after 1919, and I was part of that generation which had never seen the landscape of what Negroes sometimes call the old country. I mean, that was like, a movement, right? That was a reality, right? That was like, a human mass, right? People were, at some point disconnected from that old country, right? They would think of the South as the old country, right? I mean, think about how different it must be, like after emancipation, after Reconstruction. what would you expect as a black person going north, right? In some ways, it could be a different country. It's easier for me to imagine that about my own family coming from Belarus and Russia and so on. But this is also like a lived reality, even to Americans as well, right? And it's very easy to ignore that because especially in the modern world, like you could sort of live your own reality. You could live in your own bubble, especially if you belong to, the part of the economy where you didn't slip under the cracks, right? Or rather through the cracks. You didn't have to experience this kind of like total leveling of wealth and feeling like, you're just building and building, your whole life, but you seem to be going backwards. But this must have been the case, and I'm just like wondering, has there ever been a book, right, a novel or a set of books like focusing on this disconnect between the old country and the coming north, and what really that would have looked like, felt like, people can very easily dismiss like history, right, or rather like art, right? They could easily dismiss writing as just just nonsense, right? Like we just need there's some people that only read nonfiction. I've known people like that. Like they think fiction is useless, but the fact is there's nothing in nonfiction that you would ever read, right, that would probably be all that interesting. Like looking at these disconnects, you probably do need to see it set into the context of some sort of work of art, right, to really make it real in the same way that Mark Twain made, not so much because it's not so much about slavery, but the logic of slavery real. He made the logic of childhood real, right? So it made me wonder about that because I realized that I never quite thought about what this would have looked like, and it's always good to, when you come across something like that, to just stop and think and imagine it, right, and see where it fits and see what might have escaped your notice. He had been born in New Orleans and had been a quite young man there during the time that Louis Armstrong, a boy, was running errands for the dives and honky-tonks of what always presented to me as one of the most wicked of cities. To this day, whenever I think of New Orleans, I also helplessly think of Sodom and Gomorrah. My father never mentioned Louis Armstrong, except to forbid us to play his records. But there was a picture of him on our wall for a long time. One of my father's strong-willed female relatives had placed it there and forbade my father to take it down. He never did, but he eventually maneuvered her out of the house, and when, some years later, she was in trouble and near death, he refused to do anything to help her. Okay, so far, you don't have that much characterization in the first paragraph up there, right, of his father. You get a little bit of the personal history, right? The fact that nobody knows when he was born, which is not, I guess, too uncommon. My great-grandmother did not exactly know when she was born. We always assumed it was February 1924, which was always like a fun assumption to me because it was like, hey, that's even like before the death of Lenin. Like she was literally born when Lenin was alive. But this is a reality, right? When people don't know when they're born, and that does something to like situate his father, right, in terms of like, a place, a time, what he must have experienced growing up. Like if you did not know when you were born exactly, it probably does say something about, your material conditions growing up, right? If you could be so kind of outside of society that you can't even have like a document indicating, your existence in that way. But by the time they would get here, right, we characterize his father not so much just by describing him, but in relation to his family, right? And the family part of it will play a big role in the essay. And I wonder about this, right? So one of my father's strong-willed female relatives had placed it there and forbade my father to take it down. So first of all, with all the stereotypes that we have about like patriarchy and what it must have been like for men and women, 5 decades ago, 10 decades ago, 5 centuries ago, whatever. This kind of cuts through, those like broad, almost worthless strokes, and gives you something specific, right? This was a male, right? This was a dad. He was the patriarch of the family, and this is the way that he would posture, as you'll see as the essay goes on. But he also had a strong-willed female relative. So a woman, it seems, that was even stronger than he was, despite the fact that she's a woman and he's a man. And she placed this thing there that he didn't want, and he said, and he wanted to take it down, but she said no, and he listened to her, right? He listened to her, right? This is going to be important as the essay emerges. And ultimately, just think of how much characterization we get here, right? So we have that passive aspect of his father that is kind of like too, I guess, frightened to, demand of his house, to look in the way that it wants it to look. But he, instead of kicking her out, he eventually maneuvered her out of the house, right? So, extra passivity. She was in trouble and near death. He refused to do anything to help her. That's kind of like, that almost strikes me, although he doesn't ever make it clear. I think that's Baldwin sort of saying about his father that he had these passive qualities, right? He wasn't truly the patriarch that he wanted to be. And then ultimately, when it came to helping this person out that was in need of help, despite the fact that he was a Christian, despite the fact that he was a preacher, right? His kind of like ultimate petty revenge was, like, remember what you did with my wall? Now this is what I'm going to do or not do for you. He was, I think, very handsome. And you wonder this, like, I think, is this kind of like an informality? We know it's Baldwin, so there's like, obvious kind of meaning behind everything. But this I think, right? Is this a personal opinion? Is this like truly so? Is this like a trick of his memory, right? And in fact, as we go out to see, like, it's all three. He was, I think, very handsome. I gathered this from photographs from my own memories of him, dressed in his Sunday best and on his way to preach a sermon somewhere when I was little. Handsome, proud, and ingrown, like a toenail, somebody said. This is one of the lines I've always remembered from this essay. Handsome, proud, and ingrown, like a toenail, somebody said, right? This is the description that he's choosing for his father. But he looked to me as I grew older like pictures I had seen of African tribal chieftains. He really should have been naked with war paint on and barbaric mementos, standing among spears. He could be chilling in the pulpit and indescribably cruel in his personal life, and he was certainly the most bitter man I have ever met. Yet it must be said that there was something else in him, buried in him, which lent him his tremendous power and even a rather crushing charm. It had something to do with his blackness, I think. He was very black. With his blackness and his beauty, and with the fact that he knew that he was black but did not know that he was beautiful. He claimed to be proud of his blackness, but it had also been the cause of much humiliation, and it had fixed bleak boundaries to his life. Think about this little sentence. You could have said, it could have fixed tight boundaries, harsh boundaries. All those would have worked, but, as Mark Twain says, the difference between the right word and the almost right word is like the difference between lightning bug and lightning. To say bleak boundaries, like that in and of itself, right? It's almost as if like it's kind of redundant, right? Like we have a boundary that exists. By making it bleak, we're just emphasizing exactly what we already know, right, about the black experience, in 1954, and what many of his own kind of like liberal readers would have known. Had fixed bleak boundaries to his life. He was not a young man when we were growing up, and he had already suffered many kinds of ruin. In his outrageously demanding and protective way, he loved his children, who were black like him and menaced like him. And all these things sometimes showed in his face when he tried, never to my knowledge with any success, to establish contact with any of us. When he took one of his children on his knee to play, the child always became fretful and began to cry. When he tried to help one of us with our homework, the absolutely unabating tension which emanated from him caused our minds and our tongues to become paralyzed, so that he, scarcely knowing why, flew into a rage, and the child, not knowing why, was punished. If it ever entered his head to bring a surprise home for his children, It was almost unfailingly the wrong surprise, and even the big watermelons he often brought home in his back in the summertime led to the most appalling scenes. This is also another thing that I've always remembered from this essay. Just think about the fact that, like, so the way that he's describing his father. First of all, we sometimes get like specific flashes of like reasons why there's this bitterness, kind of like between the two of them and towards each other, right? Between Baldwin and his father. But a lot of it is just kind of, it's left to implication. We don't get so many specifics. Like, we just get the sense of like there's something about this father that is, well, we know that he's bitter, right? But there's something about him that just makes everybody uncomfortable, right? There's something off about him. What does this have to do with his blackness? Maybe it has something to do with it. Maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe his father, in any other situation, in any other life, maybe his blueprint was such that this is ultimately, the extent of the family relationships that he could have with anyone in any context. But here we also have like this, right? Like, just imagine this. Even the big watermelons he often brought home in his back in the summertime led to the most appalling scenes. I mean, what exactly about him? What could he do that is like so wrong, right? That a watermelon, right? Just a watermelon that he would bring just for the family to eat would lead to the most appalling scenes. I did not remember in all those years that one of his children was ever glad to see him come home. From what I was able to gather of his early life, it seemed that this inability to establish contact with other people had always marked him and had been one of the things which had driven him out of New Orleans. There was something in him, therefore, groping and tentative, which was never expressed and which was buried with him. One saw it most clearly when he was facing new people and hoping to impress them. But he never did, not for long. We went from church to smaller and more improbable church. He found himself in less and less demand as a minister, and by the time he died, none of his friends had come to see him for a long time. He had lived and died in an intolerable bitterness of spirit, and it frightened me, as we drove him to the graveyard through those unquiet, ruined streets, to see how powerful and overflowing this bitterness could be, and to realize that this bitterness now was mine. When he died, I had been away from home for a little over a year. In that year, I had time to become aware of the meaning of all my father's bitter warnings, had discovered the secret of his profoundly pursed lips and rigid carriage. I had discovered the weight of white people in the world. I saw that this had been for my ancestors and now would be for me an awful thing to live with, and that the bitterness which had helped to kill my father could also kill me. I'm not exactly sure the specifics of Baldwin's personal experiences growing up, obviously, but I'm sure like anybody growing up in the kind of diverse community would sort of know this themselves. Like, I remember as a kid, I was surrounded by Hasidic Jews, but I was also surrounded by I had a friend from Egypt. I had kids from different parts of China that I was friends with. Right, obviously, Russians and Jews and so on and so forth. Hispanic kids. One kid from Colombia, I remember. And when I was friends with them when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, beyond the fact that I spoke a different language and hey, I found a little camaraderie in the fact that a lot of these other kids would speak other languages and native-born kids, most of them just only spoke English. I didn't really see that much distinction between us. Like, to me, it was like, oh, my family came from this country and we speak this language at home. And this kid came from this country and he speaks this language here and he speaks this language here, so on and so forth. You don't really see people necessarily, right, as a kid, as truly distinct from you, right? That does, in some level, have to be hammered in. It has to be hammered in by the realities of segregation. Right? If you're James Baldwin back then, segregation is much more bitter and much more relevant to you. But understanding how white people fit into this world, that would have taken time, right? Understanding why your family might be bitter, why your father might be bitter, understanding why you have all these people around you that are, sort of giving you these warnings that you don't understand. That takes time. He had been ill a long time. In the mind, as we now realize, reliving instances of his fantastic intransigence in the new light of his affliction, endeavoring to feel a sorrow for him which never quite came true. We had not known that he was being eaten up by paranoia, and the discovery that his cruelty to our bodies and our minds had been one of the symptoms of his illness was not then enough to enable us to forgive him. The younger children felt, quite simply, relief that he would not be coming home anymore. My mother's observation that it was he, after all, who had kept them alive all these years meant nothing, because of the problems of keeping children alive are not real for children. Let's read that again. My mother's observation that it was he, after all, who had kept them alive all these years meant nothing, because the problems of keeping children alive are not real for children. I mean, is there anything more real? I grew up in a single parent household, and I remember having at some point, when I was started becoming more cognizant of things when I was 8, 9, 10, I would be, resentful of my mom. The fact that she was constantly out of the house, right? She would be gone for sometimes a week or 2 weeks at a time, and I would be left to be watched by others. And I couldn't understand this, right? The fact that she was out there and she had to be out there working for me, right? That is a real problem to her. It's not a real problem to me. I would, by some magical force, right, be taken care of. And children, who believe in magic and these kinds of forces, they also have this assumption that there is some kind of magical force, some sort of inertia, right? They will always take care of them. The older children felt, with my father gone, that they could invite their friends to the house without fear that their friends would be insulted, or, as had sometimes happened with me, being told that their friends were in league with the devil and intended to rob our family of everything we owned. I didn't fail to wonder, and it made me hate him, what on earth we owned that anybody else would want. His illness was beyond all hope of healing before anyone realized that he was ill. He had always been so strange and had lived like a prophet in such unimaginably close communion with the Lord that his long silences, which were punctuated by moans and hallelujahs and snatches of old songs while he sat at the living room window, never seemed odd to us. It was not until he refused to eat because he said his family was trying to poison him that my mother was forced to accept as a fact what had, until then, been only an unwilling suspicion. When he was committed, it was discovered that he had tuberculosis, and, as it turned out, the disease of his mind allowed the disease of his body to destroy him. For his doctors could not force him to eat either, and though he was fed intravenously, it was clear from the beginning that there was no hope for him. In my mind's eye, I could see him sitting at the window, locked up in his terrors, hating and fearing every living soul, including his children who had betrayed him too, by reaching toward the world which had despised him. So imagine that, right? I mean, you're bitter against the world, right? You see, just objectively, your situation as a black man isn't very good. But now you see your kids, right, who are, they're a new generation. There are new things happening, right, in the 30s and the 40s. Things are not exactly what they must have been like for you. And you see them sort of, getting some of the benefits of this life, right? You see them becoming more educated than you, perhaps smarter than you. So you see them reaching toward this world, and they're getting the things that you cannot get. And to a certain kind of personality, yes, that will be troubling, that would be damaging, that will, engender all manner of hatred. There were 9 of us. I began to wonder what it could have felt like for such a man to have had 9 children whom he could barely feed. He used to make little jokes about our poverty, which never, of course, seemed very funny to us. They could not have seemed very funny to him either, or else our all too feeble response to them would have never caused such rages. He spent great energy and achieved, to our chagrin, no small amount of success in keeping us away from the people who surrounded us. people who had all-night rent parties to which we listened when we should have been sleeping, people who cursed and drank and flashed razor blades on Lenox Avenue. He could not understand why, if they had so much energy to spare, they could not use it to make their lives better. He treated almost everybody in our block with the most uncharitable asperity, and neither they nor, of course, their children were slow to reciprocate. The only white people who came to our house were welfare workers and bill collectors. It was almost always my mother who dealt with them, for my father's temper, which was at the mercy of his pride, was never to be trusted. It was clear that he felt their very presence in his home to be a violation. This was conveyed by his carriage, almost ludicrously stiff, and by his voice, harsh and vindictively polite. When I was around 9 or 10, I wrote a play which was directed by a young white schoolteacher, a woman who then took an interest in me and gave me books to read, and in order to corroborate my theatrical bent, decided to take me to see what she somewhat tactlessly referred to as, quote, real plays. Theater going was forbidden in our house, but with the really cruel intuitiveness of a child, I suspected that the color of this woman's skin would carry the day for me. When at school she suggested taking me to the theater, I did not, as I might have done if she had been a Negro, find a way of discouraging her, but agreed that she should pick me up at my house one evening. I then very cleverly left all the rest to my mother, who suggested to my father, as I knew she would, that it would not be very nice to let such a kind woman make the trip for nothing. Also, since it was a school teacher, I imagined that my mother countered the idea of sin with the idea of education, which word, even with my father, carried a kind of bitter weight. Before the teacher came, my father took me aside to ask why she was coming, what interest she could possibly have in our house and a boy like me. I said I didn't know, but I too suggested that it had something to do with education. And I understood that my father was waiting for me to say something. I didn't quite know what. Perhaps that I wanted his protection against this teacher and her education. I said none of these things, and the teacher came and we went out. It was clear during the brief interview in our living room that my father was agreeing very much against his will, and that he would have refused permission if he had dared. The fact that he did not dare caused me to despise him. I had no way of knowing that he was facing in that living room a wholly unprecedented and frightening situation. So just to understand and, try to, imagine what his father felt. So first of all, right, they are living in poverty, right? He has many kids that he can't fully take care of. And here, we have this kind of interloper, right? We have this white woman, and of course he grows up, not trusting white people very much. And Baldwin, right, who's coming of age a little bit, who is not being protected by his father because his father can't, right? He doesn't have the material means. His father also can't help but be strange, right? He characterizes him as very strange. He can help that awkwardness and that weirdness about him. The one possibility that he has is, okay, so in this kind of very weird way, right? Here we have this white interloper. What does she want with you, James? And Baldwin, though, does not seek, right, his protection, right? And the father can't provide it. Right, this has to be he mentions the various humiliations. This must be yet another humiliation, and the fact that he is, he hadn't dared, and you're wondering, well, what exactly is that daring, right? Is it the fact that this is now a white woman, a teacher, right, a part of the posh world that you can never be a part of? She's now sitting in this room, and she's presently trying to take your son to this play. Do you not dare because you simply cannot make a scene in front of white people, especially white people like this? Or, is there something else going on? And Baldwin, on some level, he sort of implies that he understands that conflict, right? He understands that his father is passive, right? We already know that he didn't take that portrait of Louis Armstrong down because, he, I guess, feared his sister. And now, like, getting old enough, right? The fact that he did not dare caused me to despise him, right? The fact that his father was that passive, right? The fact that your father should not be that passive. This calls to mind like Nietzsche in the Gay Science. He has this line that that I often think about myself. Not yet having children yet. He says something like, for every man out there that wants to have children, does a man ever stop to think, do I deserve to be a father? Right. And, if you frame it that way, like, it sounds like almost kind of like, psychopathic, right? The idea that you would sort of, take fatherhood away from people willy-nilly simply because, like, someone, made the decision that they don't deserve it, right? And of course, Nietzsche's understanding of desert, right, in that way, right, who deserves what, is kind of different from the average person's. But even if we call it, kind of like a little bit of a psychopathic question, I think it's a very relevant question to ask, right? If not necessarily of yourself, because it's not the most healthy way of viewing the world, and especially not a healthy way of viewing fatherhood or children. It's still useful to ask because there are men out there, specifically in the kind of circumstances that James Baldwin's father must have been in, who do ask this question of themselves, if not consciously, then unconsciously, right? Do I deserve to be a father? I have 9 kids. I can barely take care of this 9. And, one of them is grown to hate me, and he's, more educated than I am. He's more intelligent than I am. And he knows exactly what my faults are, right? Did I really deserve this, right? Because look what the end result is, right? So I always find that an interesting kind of a thought experiment, if only to just briefly entertain it for the sake of these kinds of, issues of like situational awareness, right? Later, when my father had been laid off from his job, this woman became very important to us. She was really a very sweet and generous woman and went to a great deal of trouble to be of help to us, particularly during one awful winter. My mother called her by the highest name she knew. She said she was a Christian. My father could scarcely disagree, but during the 4 or 5 years of our relatively close association, he never trusted her and was always trying to surprise in her open Midwestern face the genuine, cunningly hidden, and hideous motivation. In later years, particularly when it began to be clear that this education of mine was going to lead me to perdition, he became more explicit and warned me that my white friends in high school were not really my friends, and that I would see when I was older how white people would do anything to keep a Negro down. Some of them could be nice, he admitted, but none of them were to be trusted, and most of them were not even nice. The best thing was to have as little to do with them as possible. I did not feel this way, and I was certain in my innocence that I never would. Now, putting aside the question of whether or not James Baldwin would ultimately come to feel this way, think about, this stream started, we were doing MLK, we did his speech condemning the war in Vietnam. Think about the fact that after that happened, like, this is literally the result. Like, these are white people. These are white liberals who say they are on the black man's side for, in terms of the Negro question, right? And yet this is what we have. We just have like fucking condescension. We have stay in your lane. We have you're doing great damage simply because, right? Not because he said anything that is really kind of against their own sensibilities in terms of, whether or not they personally like war and murder and imperialism or whatever. Because of course, like as liberals, they would say, no, we don't. But doing this sort of thing, right? When you're a fan of the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, right? As a Democrat, right? As a liberal, that does sort of start damaging like you, right? In terms of like where you fit into all these questions. And like these white people, like they were not to be trusted, right? The second that a certain portion of the status quo that was higher stakes gets violated, that's a big red line, right? Someone even says like, crosses a line. Like, what was the phrase? What do they say? He crosses a, what was it? Anyway, whatever. They said that he crossed the line, right? So something of white people felt threatened there, right? The rights didn't threaten these liberals, but this thing did, right? Because they're so linked with the regime, right? They're so linked with also that media culture, right? So like whether or not we see his father's warnings as just kind of like cynical bullshit. His father clearly had plenty of reason for saying that, and this will continue to bear itself out into the 60s. Even an icon like MLK had to feel, right, the threat, right, and the vindictiveness of shit libs, right, white shit libs. But the year which preceded my father's death had made a great change in my life. I had been living in New Jersey, working in defense plants, working and living among Southerners, white and black. I knew about the South, of course, and about how Southerners treated Negroes and how they expected them to behave. But it had never entered my mind that anyone would look at me and expect me to behave that way. I learned in New Jersey that to be a Negro meant precisely that one was never looked at but was simply at the mercy of the reflexes of the color of one's skin caused in other people. I acted in New Jersey as I had always acted, that is, as though I had thought a great deal of myself. I had to act that way with the results that were simply unbelievable. And this is also something very easy to sort of like just gloss over, right? This statement. So first of all, like, like abstractly, right? Like, about how Southerners treated Negroes and how they expected them to behave, but it had never entered my mind that anyone would look at me and expect me to behave that way, right? This is how you get sort of into adulthood, right? That people don't make these kinds of distinctions, and this other part, right? That as a black person, one was never looked at but was simply at the mercy of the reflexes of the color of one's skin caused in other people. Going back to more contemporary events, like when we look at like George Zimmerman, right, and Trayvon Martin, and the justifications that people used for the killing of Trayvon Martin, right? It always looked like something like, and originally when I took like a pro kind of like, well, it wasn't really a pro Zimmerman side. I said that manslaughter was a more appropriate charge from like a legal standpoint. But part of the way that I was thinking about it was, like Zimmerman essentially said, hey, I saw this guy, I saw this kid, I followed him, and ultimately he confronted me, and I got scared, right? And you never get to fucking say that in any other situation unless like you're a white person with a gun against a black person. I mean, it's like, what do you mean you were scared, right? Like if you're if you're in any other situation, being scared, right, is never a good enough explanation for engaging in a set of events, right? That the end of that causal chain ends with like you slaying a teenager, right? Due to your own actions, your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own whims, right? Right, simply at the mercy of the reflexes and the color of one's skin caused in other people, right? This is real. I mean, this is what people every day have to think about and go through, right? I mean, and it's very easy to not see that because if you don't go through it yourself, right? Why would you? In the same way that when it comes to like other kinds of privileges, like being a man that is on average, like I'm better looking, physically than average, right? And it makes me think like, well, what do ugly people like experience day to day, right? I mean, ugly people must have lives that are so different from me, like like especially if you're an ugly woman, right? The kinds of men that you could get, right? Quality men that will take care of you, men that will care about you. The fact is, like, there is a relationship between the way you look physically as a woman and the way that the kinds of men that want to approach you, right? And the kinds of men that you will ultimately come to accept, right? There was actually recently a banned subreddit called like true female cells or something, like for like female like incels, involuntary celibates. And it's kind of like it's kind of sick that they banned it, because like this subreddit was just for like a bunch of girls that were like truly like, I've never seen photos of them, but I assume when they were saying they were truly fucking ugly, that they were. And the kinds of discussions that they had was it was mostly about the kinds of extreme exploitation in games that are played by men, like in that situation where you have like a man approaching like an extremely unattractive woman. Like if you think about it, like in that situation, you would be scraping the bottom of the barrel, when it comes to like, being a woman, right? Men, that refuse to like work, men that have all sorts of like, substance abuse problems, men that are, philanderers to the extent that they can be, right? I assume maybe they won't have the chance. But the point that I'm making is just like, depending on how you look, or like, your height, right? The fact that I'm only 5'8", I've never been one of these people that gives a shit about my weight, but the fact is, it is true that if you're like 6'3" or 6'5" or whatever, you will have better careers, you'll have more money, you'll have more of everything, right? And it's very easy to like not understand what another person's experience is, because like you don't have that physical feature, right? You don't have that capability or that incapability. I mention these other things besides race, because when people talk about black and white, and of course, like people start rolling their fucking eyes, like, oh, there you go again with your fucking politically correct bullshit about race and being black in America, blah blah blah. Everybody has it hard, right? But when you speak in terms of like, imagine if you were fucking ugly, or imagine if you were a guy that, I have never complained about my height, but maybe if I was 5'2" or 5'3", maybe I would, be resentful and bitter, because, that's another kind of reality, right? As a 5'2" man in America, right? Anyway, sorry about that diatribe. Okay, so I had scarcely arrived before I had earned the enmity, which was extraordinarily ingenious, of all my superiors and nearly all my coworkers. In the beginning, to make matters worse, I simply did not know what was happening. I did not know what I had done, and I shortly began to wonder what anyone could possibly do to bring about such unanimous, active, and unbearable vocal hostility. I knew about Jim Crow, but I had never experienced it. I went to the same self-service restaurant 3 times and stood with all the Princeton boys before the counter, waiting for a hamburger and coffee. It was always an extraordinarily long time before anything was set before me. But it was not until the 4th visit that I learned that, in fact, nothing had ever been set before me. I had simply picked something up. Negroes were not served there, I was told, and they had been waiting for me to realize that I was always the only Negro present. Once I was told this, I determined to go there all the time. But now they were ready for me, and though some dreadful scenes were subsequently enacted in that restaurant, I never ate there again. It was the same story all over New Jersey, in bars, bowling alleys, diners, places to live. I was always being forced to leave silently or with mutual imprecations. I very shortly became notorious, and children giggled behind me when I passed, and their elders whispered or shouted. They really believed that I was mad. And it did begin to work on my mind, of course. I began to be afraid to go anywhere, and to compensate for this, I went places to which I really should not have gone, and where, God knows, I had no desire to be. My reputation in town naturally enhanced my reputation at work, and my working day became one long series of acrobatics designed to keep me out of trouble. I cannot say that these acrobatics succeeded. It began to seem that the machinery of the organization I worked for was turning over day and night with but one aim: to eject me. I was fired once and contrived, with the aid of a friend from New York, to get back on the payroll, was fired again and bounced back again. It took a while to fire me for the 3rd time, but the 3rd time took. There were no loopholes anywhere. There was not even any way of getting back inside the gates. That year in New Jersey, lives in my mind as though it were the year during which, having an unsuspected predilection for it, I first contracted some dread chronic disease, the unfailing symptom of which is a kind of blind fever, a pounding in the skull and fire in the bowels. Once this disease is contracted, one can never really be carefree again, for the fever, without an instant's warning, can recur at any moment. It can wreck more important things than race relations. There is not a Negro alive who does not have this rage in his blood. One has the choice merely of living with it consciously or surrendering to it. As for me, this fever has recurred in me and does and will until the day I die. Again, so what he's saying is real. Just like what I said about ugly people. If you're an exceptionally ugly person, especially if you're an ugly woman, your life is going to look extremely different from, the kind of general polite society, right? These people are not allowed into polite society. If you're a black person, especially during the time that, James Baldwin was growing up, you're going to have some kind of rage eventually. It has always shocked me that this rage doesn't come out more and more, but every once in a while it does, right? We get yet another race riot brought upon yet again by some other instance of police brutality, and then we have all the fucking moralizing, which starts again. Guys, don't riot. But the point is, if you want to say don't riot, the sickness of the blood, what are you gonna do about it, right? Because this is really what's causing it, right? My last night in New Jersey, a white friend from New York took me to the nearest big town, Trenton, to go to the movies and have a few drinks. As it turned out, he also saved me from, at the very least, a violent whipping. Almost every detail of that night stands out very clearly in my memory. I even remember the name of the movie we saw because its title impressed me as being so patently ironical. It was a movie about the German occupation of France, starring Maureen O'Hara and Charles Lawton, called This Land Is Mine. I remember the name of the diner we walked into when the movie ended. It was the American Diner. When we walked in, the counterman asked what we wanted, and I remember answering with the casual sharpness which had become my habit. We want a hamburger and a cup of coffee. What do you think we want? I do not know why, after a year of such rebuffs, I so completely failed to anticipate his answer, which was, of course, we don't serve Negroes here. This reply failed to discompose me, at least for the moment. I made some sardonic comment about the name of the diner, and we walked out into the streets. This was the time of what was called the brownout, when the lights in all American cities were very dim. When we re-entered the streets, something happened to me which had the force of an optical illusion, or a nightmare. The streets were very crowded, and I was facing north. People were moving in every direction, but it seemed to me in that instant that all the people I could see, and many more than that, were moving toward me against me, and that everyone was white. I remember how their faces gleamed, and I felt, like a physical sensation, a click at the nape of my neck as though some interior string connecting my head to my body had been cut. I began to walk. I heard my friend call after me, but I ignored him. Heaven only knows what was going on in his mind, but he had the good sense not to touch me. I don't know what would have happened if he had, and to keep me in sight. I don't know what was going on in my mind either. I certainly had no conscious plan. I wanted to do something to crush these white faces, which were crushing me. I walked for perhaps a block or two until I came to an enormous, glittering, and fashionable restaurant, in which I knew not even the intercession of the Virgin would cause me to be served. I pushed through the doors and took the first vacant seat I saw, at a table for two, and waited. So I talked about this earlier, right? This white guilt, right, that especially liberals have, right? And the fact that there's always this fear, right? Even among modern day reactionaries too, right? That hey, full equality for blacks means that they will eventually turn the tables on us, especially if we become a minority, right? Because if we did this to them, of course they're going to do it to us. And every single kind of black author that I read from this time period, there's always eventually some kind of comedy, even if they don't focus on it, right? I mean, Baldwin never really focuses on his anger or his hatred. But there's always this kind of thing that, they want to kill white people, right? This urge, whether or not it's actually acted upon, right? But there's always this urge, right? And I'm sure that to the extent that this urge exists, is also to the extent that there is that kind of white guilt or white fear about, what would it be like to be a minority, right, in a all kind of, black nation or whatever. I do not know how long I wait, and you'll see this, this kind of plays out in The Waitress. I do not know how long I waited, and I rather wonder until today what I could possibly have looked like. Whatever I looked like, I frightened the waitress who shortly appeared, and the moment she appeared, all of my fury flowed toward her. I hated her for her white face, and for her great, astounded, frightened eyes. I felt that if she found a black man so frightening, I would make her fright worthwhile. She did not ask me what I wanted, but repeated, as though she had learned it somewhere, "We don't serve Negroes here." Right? And this has always stuck out to me too, right? She repeated it as if she had learned it somewhere. It's not even that she necessarily herself wants to personally not serve this guy, right? It's not as if that she herself might even necessarily have these feelings, right? But this is just the inertia of society, right? This is what you're given. This is the input that you received. And the way that she acts here, saying that we don't serve Negroes here, that is the output, right? This is cause and effect. This is predictable. It has to be predictable, right? Because human behavior is predictable. She did not say it with the blunt, derisive hostility to which I had grown so accustomed, but rather with a note of apology in her voice and fear. This made me colder and more murderous than ever. I felt I had to do something with my hands. I wanted her to come close enough for me to get to her neck, for me to get her neck between my hands. So I pretended not to have understood her, hoping to draw her closer. And she did step a very short step closer, with her pencil poised incongruously over her pad, and repeated the formula, "Don't serve Negroes here." Somehow, with the repetition of that phrase, which was already ringing in my head like 1,000 bells of a nightmare, I realized that she would never come any closer and that I would have to strike from a distance. There was nothing on the table but an ordinary water mug half full of water, and I picked this up and hurled it with all of my strength at her. She ducked, and it missed her and shattered against the mirror behind the bar. And with that sound, my frozen blood abruptly thawed. I returned from wherever I had been, and I saw for the first time the restaurant, the people with their mouths open, already, as it seemed to me, rising as one man, and I realized what I had done, and where I was, and I was frightened. I rose and began running for the door. A round, pot-bellied man grabbed me by the nape of the neck just as I reached the doors and began to beat me about the face. I kicked him and got loose and ran into the streets. My friend whispered, "Run," and I ran. So he's characterizing this feeling, right? As like this distant place, right? I returned from wherever I had been. Right. And you must think, if this is in fact the place, this must be a place that all black people, especially, during this time period, must have at some point in their lives visited, right? Perhaps they didn't stay, right? Most of them, of course, cannot, right? You have a life to live. But, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What do people today, would they ever actually know? Would they actually ever feel that? Is all you get are just a few snatches of that emotion here and there? My friend stayed outside the restaurant long enough to misdirect my pursuers and the police who arrived, he told me at once. I do not know what I said to him when he came to my room that night. I could not have said much. I felt like something's touching my neck, my leg. I felt in the oddest, most awful way that I had somehow betrayed him. I lived it over and over and over again, the way one relives an automobile accident after it has happened and one finds oneself alone and safe. I could not get over two facts, both equally difficult for the imagination to grasp, and one was that I could have been murdered, but the other was that I had been ready to commit murder. I saw nothing very clearly, but I did see this, that my life, my real life, was in danger, and not from anything other people might do, but from the hatred I carried in my own heart. Again, this is like something that I would always dismiss as a kid, But it's true, right? This hatred that you carry, and this is going to come out more later on, right? This is damaging. I mean, this is part of the reason why I often say things like, I want to be kinder on these streams. I don't want to just like call people fucking morons and idiots, no matter how much they deserve it. Because on some level, like you have to wonder, the more that you say stuff like that, how much of it is really something else, right? Baldwin always said that he learned that everything that you say about another person, really, it's you, right? It's you in disguise. And it has really stuck with me, right? Because I think this is applicable, right? This is a kind of human universal. I had returned home around the second week in June, in great haste because it seemed that my father's death and my mother's confinement were both but a matter of hours. In the case of my mother, it soon became clear that she had simply made a miscalculation. This had always been her tendency, and I don't believe that a single one of us arrived in the world, or has since arrived anywhere else, on time. But none of us dawdled so intolerably about the business of being born as did my baby sister. We sometimes amused ourselves during those endless, stifling weeks by picturing the baby sitting within the safe, warm dark, bitterly regretting the necessity of becoming a part of our chaos, and stubbornly putting it off as long as possible. I understood her perfectly, and congratulated her on showing such good sense so soon. Death, however, sat as purposefully at my father's bedside as life stirred within my mother's womb, and it was harder to understand why he so lingered in that long shadow. It seemed that he had bent, and for a long time too, all of his energies toward dying. Now death was ready for him, but my father held back. All of Harlem indeed seemed to be infected by waiting. I had never known it to be so violently still. Racial tensions throughout this country were exacerbated during the early years of the war, partly because the labor market brought together hundreds of thousands of ill-prepared people, and partly because Negro soldiers, regardless of where they were born, received their military training in the South. What happened in defense plants and army camps had repercussions, naturally, in every Negro ghetto. The situation in Harlem had grown bad enough for clergymen, policemen, educators, politicians, and social workers to assert in one breath that there was no crime wave, and to offer in the very next breath suggestions as to how to combat it. Just like, like shit libs, whether it's like well-intentioned or not, like the past year, right, during the riots, they were pretending like riots weren't actually happening. Like you see the media doing that, right? You have like famously CNN standing next to like literally like a huge open flame saying, oh, these are like mostly like peaceful protests, nothing's going on. And part of it is like, yeah, like they want to make like Biden look good. They want to make Kamala Harris look good. Fine. But a lot of it is also to just like, protect their own necks, right? Like they like if you assume that a riot is going on and you assume there is a cause, well, that assumption means that you must do something about it. And if all you have is something performative, which is usually how far people want to push it, right? Some sort of performative correction to the problem. That's going to make it recur again and again. These suggestions always seemed to involve playgrounds, despite the fact that racial skirmishes were occurring in the playgrounds too. Oh my God! Like that's such a like people saying in the 40s that the solution was somewhere in the playground strikes me a lot like when you have like people talking about microaggressions and saying that the solution to racism is like diversity training of some sort, and a sort of like attenuation of these microaggressions by conscious effort, right? Which is just so asinine. Playground or not, crime wave or not, the Harlem police force had been augmented in March, and the unrest grew, perhaps in fact partly as a result of the ghetto's instinctive hatred of policemen. Right, which is why people kept saying over and over again, you bring in the military to these riots, you're going to make it worse, right? Perhaps the most revealing news item out of the steady parade of reports of muggings, stabbings, shootings, assaults, gang wars, and accusations of police brutality is the item concerning 6 Negro girls who set upon a white girl in the subway because, as they all too accurately put it, she was stepping on their toes. Indeed she was, all over the nation. Right. And I found this always to be such a smart little paragraph, an ending to the paragraph, because, like anytime something happens, whether it's like, George Floyd gets like murdered or whatever, and you get the same kind of, moronic conversations like, oh, like, well, was that really racist? Do we actually know that this cop personally was racist? Do we know that he harbored hatred in his heart? How do we know that? How do we know that? How do we know that? As if like that's the fucking relevant question. I mean, these 6 Negro girls who set upon a white girl in the subway, whether or not she was personally stepping on their toes, I mean, that might have been, who knows? I don't know exactly what incident he's talking about. But the more relevant lens to view this from, even if you want to condemn individually, like, the actions of these girls, again, I don't know the specifics of this situation. Even if you want to condemn, like, the actions of these girls, you have to remember that just in a kind of generic way, right? In a metaphorical way, indeed, she was all over the nation. It doesn't fucking matter whether that cop, right? I even forget his name now, that murdered George Floyd. It doesn't matter whether he personally was racist. The fact is, there is something going on in America that sets things up in such a way that there can be a white man kneeling with his knee, right, on a black man's neck, and ultimately, kill him by choking him that way. The fact that that is a reasonable course of events that we could sort of predict, whether it's like a knee to the neck, whether it's Eric Garner getting choked out by a cop using an illegal chokehold, whether it's like something else. The fact is, like, structurally, there's something happening where indeed she was all over the nation. Like, George Floyd is just like one specific instance, right? Like, he's the instantiation of like a more kind of widespread structural problem that needs to be addressed, right? Because we know, like, in this question of like probability spaces, we take 1,000 George Floyds, like, dealing with the cops. It's true that if you run that simulation 1,000 times, not every one of those simulations has George Floyd dying, right? Maybe you have a knee to the neck where nobody dies. Maybe you have no knee to the neck. Maybe some other situation occurs. But you do that 1,000 times, you're going to get someone that dies there, right? You're going to get many people that die there, perhaps, right? So always we want to think about these probability spaces and these simulations, and without even like, I'm not sure if like that kind of vocabulary was even truly available back then. People maybe didn't think of these terms, but he sort of says like kind of what I've been arguing, right? Indeed, she was all over the nation. These little girls don't matter, right? They're just the excuse, right? I had never before been so aware of policemen on foot, on horseback, on corners everywhere, always 2 by 2. Nor had I ever been so aware of small knots of people. They were on stoops and on corners and in doorways, and what was striking about them, I think, was that they did not seem to be talking. Never, when I passed these groups, did the usual sound of a curse or a laugh ring out, and neither did there seem to be any hum of gossip. There was certainly, on the other hand, occurring between them communication extraordinarily intense. Another thing that was striking was the unexpected diversity of the people who made up these groups. Usually, for example, one would see a group of Sharpies standing on the street corner jiving the passing chicks, or a group of older men, usually for some reason, in the vicinity of a barbershop, discussing baseball scores or the numbers, or making rather chilling observations about women they had known. Women, in a general way, tended to be seen less often together, unless they were church women or very young girls or prostitutes met together for an unprofessional instant. But that summer, I saw the strangest combinations: large, respectable, churchly matrons standing on the stoops or the corners with their hair tied up, together with a girl in sleazy satin whose face bore the marks of gin and the razor, or heavy-set, abrupt, no-nonsense older men, in company with the most disreputable and fanatical racemen, or these same racemen with the Sharpies, or these Sharpies with the churchly women. Seventh-day Adventists and Methodists and Spiritualists seemed to be hobnobbing with holly rollers, and they were all alike entangled with the most flagrant disbelievers. Something heavy in their stance seemed to indicate that they had all, incredibly, seen a common vision, and on each face there seemed to be the same strange, bitter shadow. The churchly women and the matter-of-fact, no-nonsense men had children in the army. The sleazy girls they talked to had lovers there. The sharpies and the race men had friends and brothers there. It would have demanded an unquestioning patriotism, happily as uncommon in this country as it is undesirable, for these people not to have been disturbed by the bitter letters they received, by the newspaper stories they read, not to have been enraged by the posters, then to be found all over New York, which described the Japanese as, quote, yellow-bellied Japs. It was only the racemen, to be sure, who spoke ceaselessly of being revenged. How this vengeance was to be exacted was not clear, for the indignities and dangers suffered by Negro boys in uniform, but everybody felt a directionless, hopeless bitterness, as well as that panic which can scarcely be suppressed when one knows that a human being one loves is beyond one's reach and in danger. This helplessness and this gnawing uneasiness does something at length to even the toughest mind. Perhaps the best way to sum all this up is to say that people I knew felt mainly a peculiar kind of relief when they knew that their boys were being shipped out to the South to do battle overseas. It was perhaps like feeling that the most dangerous part of a dangerous journey had been passed, and that now, even if death should come, it would come with honor and without the complicity of their countrymen. Such a death would be, in short, a fact which one could hope to live. It was on the 28th of July, which I believe was a Wednesday, that I visited my father for the first time during his illness and for the last time in his life. The moment I saw him, I knew why I had put off this visit for so long. I had told my mother that I did not want to see him because I hated him. But this was not true. It was only that I had hated him, and I wanted to hold on to this hatred. I did not want to look at him as a ruin. It was not a ruin I had hated. I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense, once hate is gone, that they will be forced to deal with pain. Absolutely. I mean, this is 100%. I mean, like if you just like think, like just think to your own life, think of your own motivations, think of any kind of hatreds you've ever expressed, right? Any kinds of hatreds you've ever felt, hatreds that you've really held on to. Because growing up as a kid, always like angry with anger problems. I had walls that. I remember we were renting a house in New Jersey. I was moving around a lot at some point, like every 6 months or so. I had a house in New Jersey. I remember the walls were just covered in my knuckle imprints because I would just go around hitting walls, right? And on some level, I can't deny that I sort of enjoy that, right? John Cassavetes, right? I'm only happy when I'm angry. I'm only happy when I'm sad. But like when you take all that away, when you take away like the anger, when you take away the hatred, this is true, right? Like you are forced to deal with pain, right? Hate is, it could be painful, I guess, in some ways, but hate, in terms of like feeling something, it's better than the pain. I remember Dan Schneider, like when one of his cats died, during like the golden age of the Cosmoetica E-list, he said something like how he would like sort of like look at the world and see the things going on, or like face like rejections by publishers, and he would say that when he was like working on the job or whatever, he would try to actively feel that kind of anger, right, towards others, right, towards injustices, simply because he didn't want to think about the pain, right, of losing a cat, which like you have to understand that the human brain is it's plastic, it's plastic in many ways, but it's also plastic in that way, right? You're gonna get any number of emotions that they seem distinct, they seem like they're doing different things, but oftentimes they're just there to cover up something underlying, right? So the fact that I felt this and I know this, right, and the fact that I still feel this now, right, to the extent that I do these streams or say nasty things about other people, there is an underlying pain, right? There is an underlying pain in my life. There's an underlying pain in everybody's life, right? I'm not special in that regard, and I can't deny that hate helps me deal with it, right? Which is one of the reasons I've tried to undo that. So, you know, you read James Baldwin for many reasons, but you're also going to read great writing like this to better understand yourself. We traveled out to him, his older sister, and myself to what seemed to be the very end of a very long island. It was hot and dusty, and we wrangled, my aunt and I, all the way out over the fact that I had recently begun to smoke, and as she said, to give myself airs. But I knew that she wrangled with me because she could not bear to face the fact of her brother's dying. Neither could I endure the reality of her despair, her unstated bafflement as to what had happened to her brother's life and her own. So we wrangled and I smoked, and from time to time she fell into a heavy reverie. Covertly, I watched her face, which was the face of an old woman. It had fallen in, the eyes were sunken and lightless. Soon she would be dying too. In my childhood, it had not been so long ago. Oh my goodness, he was the same age that I am now when he wrote this, and how many times have I felt this recently? In my childhood, it had not been so long ago. My goodness, didn't I just fucking graduate from high school? What am I doing here? In my childhood, it had not been so long ago. I had thought her beautiful. She had been quick-witted and quick-moving and very generous with all the children. Each of her visits had been an event. At one time, one of my brothers and myself had thought of running away to live with her. Now she could no longer produce out of her handbag some unexpected and yet unfamiliar delight. She made me feel pity and revulsion and fear. It was awful to realize that she no longer caused me to feel affection. The closer we came to the hospital, the more querulous she became, and at the same time, naturally, grew more dependent on me. Between pity and guilt and fear, I began to feel that there was another me trapped in my skull like a jack-in-the-box who might escape my control at any moment and fill the air with screaming. So Cookie's here, so if I do feel something in my legs, I'll know what it is. She began to cry the moment we entered the room, and she saw him lying there, all shriveled and still, like a little black monkey. The great gleaming apparatus which fed him and would have compelled him to be still, even if he had been able to move, brought to mind not beneficence, but torture. The tubes entering his arm made me think of pictures I had seen when a child, of Gulliver, tied down by the pygmies on that island. My aunt wept and wept. There was a whistling sound in my father's throat. Nothing was said. He could not speak. I wanted to take his hand to say something, but I do not know what I could have said, even if he could have heard me. He was not really in that room with us. He had at last really embarked on his journey. And though my aunt told me that he said he was going to meet Jesus, I did not hear anything except that whistling in his throat. The doctor came back and we left into that unbearable train again and home. In the morning came the telegram saying that he was dead. Then the house was suddenly full of relatives, friends, hysteria, and confusion, and I quickly left my mother and the children to the care of those impressive women who, in Negro communities at least, automatically appear at times of bereavement armed with lotions, proverbs, and patience, and an ability to cook. I went downtown. By the time I returned later the same day, my mother had been carried to the hospital and the baby had been born. So anybody new that's watching this, thank you for watching. Please hit like or subscribe if you haven't, especially if you're not subscribed. I do these streams all the time. Really interesting stuff that I do here. For my father's funeral, I had nothing black to wear, and this posed a nagging problem all day long. It was, and by the way, I will be taking comments at the end. So if you had any comments about MLK, the speech that we went over, or anything with James Baldwin or Native Son, I will take them at the end. So please leave them if you wish. For my father's funeral, I had nothing black to wear, and this posed a nagging problem all day long. It was one of those problems, simple or impossible of solution, to which the mind insanely clings in order to avoid the mind's real trouble. I spent most of the day at the downtown apartment of a girl I knew, celebrating my birthday with whiskey and wondering what to wear that night. When planning a birthday celebration, one naturally does not expect that it will be up against competition from a funeral, and this girl had anticipated taking me out that night for a big dinner and a nightclub afterwards. Sometime during the course of that long day, we decided that we would go out anyway when my father's funeral service was over. I imagine I decided it, since as the funeral hour approached, it became clearer and clearer to me that I would not know what to do with myself when it was over. The girl, stifling her very lively concern as to the possible effects of the whiskey on one of my father's chief mourners, concentrated on being conciliatory and practically helpful. She found a black shirt for me somewhere and ironed it, and dressed in the darkest pants and jacket I owned, and slightly drunk, I made my way to my father's funeral. The chapel was full, but not packed, and very quiet. There were mainly my father's relatives and his children, and here and there I saw faces I had not seen since childhood, the faces of my father's one-time friends. They were very dark and solemn now, seeming somehow to suggest that they had known all along that something like this would happen. Chief among the mourners was my aunt, who had quarreled with my father all his life, by which I do not mean to suggest that her mourning was insincere or that she had not loved him. I suppose that she was one of the few people in the world who had, and their incessant quarreling proved precisely the strength of the tie that bound them. The only other person in the world, as far as I knew, whose relationship to my father rivaled my aunt's in depth was my mother, who was not there. It seemed to me, of course, that it was a very long funeral, but it was, if anything, a rather shorter funeral than most. Nor, since there were no overwhelming, uncontrollable expressions of grief, could it be called, if I dare use the word, successful. The minister who preached my father's funeral sermon was one of the few my father had still been seeing as he neared his end. He presented to us in his sermon a man whom none of us had ever seen, a man thoughtful, patient, and forbearing, a Christian inspiration to all who knew him, and a model for his children. And no doubt the children, in their disturbed and guilty state, were almost ready to believe this. He had been remote enough to be anything, and anyway, the shock of the incontrovertible, that it was really our father lying up there in that casket, prepared the mind for anything. His sister moaned, and this grief-stricken moaning was taken as corroboration. The other faces held a dark, non-committal thoughtfulness. This was not the man they had known, but they had scarcely expected to be confronted with him. This was, in a sense, deeper than questions of fact. The man that they had not known, and the man they had not known may have been the real one. The real man, whoever he had been, had suffered, and now he was dead. This was all that was sure, and all that mattered now. Every man in that chapel hoped that when his hour came, he too would be eulogized, which is to say forgiven, and that all of his lapses, greeds, errors, and strayings from the truth would be invested with coherence and looked upon with charity. What a fucking beautiful paragraph. This was perhaps the last thing human beings could give each other, and it was what they demanded, after all, of the Lord. Only the Lord saw the midnight tears. Only he was present when one of his children, moaning and wringing hands, paced up and down the room. When one slapped one's child in anger, the recoil in the heart reverberated through heaven and became part of the pain of the universe. Wow. Even as a non-religious person, like when me and Joel in that artifact on Ecclesiastes talked about this is what I mean by sublimating religion into something else. Like that spirituality always fucking stays with you. You could see it. Even James Baldwin, like, essentially probably an atheist at this point, you could see it, right? That spirituality is still there. That never leaves. And it shouldn't leave, right? You were as weird as it sounds, you were lucky enough to be born a Christian, a religious Christian, as I was, as he was. And now you have an equally great opportunity to leave that behind while keeping the spiritual gifts in your heart and in your brain. Isn't that fucking wonderful? Be fucking happy that you used to be part of a psychotic cult. When one slapped one child in anger, the recoil in the heart reverberated through heaven and became part of the pain of the universe. And when the children were hungry and sullen and distrustful, and one watched them daily growing wilder and further away and running headlong into danger, it was the Lord who knew what the charged heart endured as the strap was laid to the backside. The Lord alone knew what one would have said if one had, like the Lord, the gift of the living word. It was the Lord who knew of the impossibility every parent in that room faced, how to prepare the child for the day when the child would be despised, and how to create in the child, by what means, a stronger antidote to this poison than one had found for oneself, right? This is why his father was so upset, right? That his children were reaching for this world, for this antidote that he himself could never have. The avenues, side streets, bars, billiard halls, hospitals, police stations, and even the playgrounds of Harlem, not to mention the houses of correction, the jails and the morgue, testify to the potency of the poison while remaining silent as to the efficacy of whatever antidote, irresistibly raising the question of whether or not such an antidote existed, raising, which was worse, the question of whether or not an antidote was desirable. Perhaps poison should be fought with poison. With these are the kinds of rationalizations one makes. With these several schisms in the mind and with more terrors in the heart than could be named, it was better not to judge the man who had gone down under an impossible burden. It was better to remember, thou knowest this man's fall, but thou knowest not his wrestling. Just think about how this paragraph just like begins with the father and the fact that people don't recognize the person that's being described, and how this lack of recognition, even if it's kind of like a fact, right? Even if they truly did not know this person as described, as constituted in this speech or whatever, that gets subtly turned, and it kind of comes all of a sudden, but then it becomes really insistent. This entire, I think this is the longest paragraph in the text. It turns into this kind of examination of the mourners themselves, right? It's not simply that, hey, you don't recognize this person and all is well and good because it's just, a factual observation that this is not the person that you knew. But it becomes all their various neuroses, all of their hatreds and their lacks and all of their own aspirations, right? Their own desires to be kind of essentially put into to essentially go through the same kind of eulogy, right? He and I never really thought about this, right? But if you think about it, it's kind of true, right? Every man in the chapel hoped that when his hour came, he too would be eulogized, which is to say forgiven, right? Everybody wants this kind of forgiveness. Everybody wants to feel that they have been sort of doing the right thing. And just like they're sort of not wanting to give that to this father, right? Because, hey, this is not really the person that we knew. Baldwin seems to be saying, without quite explicitly saying it, that, hey, let's actually be more charitable here, because this thing that he did, all the wrongs that he did, we did a ton of wrongs too, and we don't want to be remembered for that, right? We want to be eulogized in the way that he's being eulogized. The fact that this just turns into this examination of these neuroses, it's just such a wonderful writerly turn, right? This is the thing that I respect. The reason why I want to read something like this, right? I'm not going to read pages and pages of shit for you guys. I mean, come on, you should know me by now. You make me feel like MLK. Do you not know what I stand for? While the preacher talked and I watched the children, years of changing their diapers, scrubbing them, slapping them, taking them to school, and scolding them had perhaps the inevitable result of making me love them, though I am not sure I knew this then. My mind was busily breaking out with a rash of disconnected impressions. Snatches of popular songs, indecent jokes, bits of books I had read, movie sequences, faces, voices, political issues. I thought I was going mad, all these impressions suspended, as it were, in the solution of the faint nausea produced in me by the heat and liquor. For a moment I had the impression that my alcoholic breath, inefficiently disguised with chewing gum, filled the entire chapel. Then someone began singing one of my father's favorite songs, and abruptly I was with him, sitting on his knee, in the hot, enormous, crowded church, which was the first church we attended. It was the Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. We had not gone there long. With this image, a host of others came. I had forgotten, in the rage of my growing up, how proud my father had been of me when I was little. Apparently, I had had a voice, and my father had liked to show me off before the members of the church. I had forgotten what he had looked like when he was pleased, but now I remembered that he had always been grinning with pleasure when my solos ended. I even remembered certain expressions on his face when he teased my mother. Had he loved her? I would never know. And when had it all begun to change? For now it seemed that he had not always been cruel. I remembered being taken for a haircut and scraping my knee on the footrest of the barber's chair, and I remembered my father's face as he soothed my crying and applied the stinging iodine. Then I remembered our fights which had been of the worst possible kind because my technique had been silence. I remembered the one time in all our life together when we had really spoken to each other. It was on a Sunday, and it must have been shortly before I left home. We were walking, just the two of us, in our usual silence, to or from church. I was in high school and had been doing a lot of writing, and I was, at about this time, the editor of the high school magazine. But I had also been a young minister, and I had been preaching from the pulpit. Lately, I had been taking fewer engagements and preached as rarely as possible. It was said in the church quite truthfully that I was, quote, cooling off. My father asked me abruptly, "You'd rather write than preach, wouldn't you?" I was astonished at his question, because it was a real question. I answered yes. That was all we said. It was awful to remember that was all we had ever said. The casket now was open, and the mourners were being led up to the aisle to look for the last time on the deceased. The assumption was that the family was too overcome with grief to be allowed to make this journey alone, and I watched while my aunt was led to the casket, and muffled in black and shaking, led back to her seat. I disapproved of forcing the children to look on their dead father, considering that the shock of his death, or more truthfully, the shock of death as a reality, was already a little more than a child could bear. But my judgment in this matter had been overruled, and there they were, bewildered and frightened and very small, being led one by one to the casket. But there is also something very gallant about children at such moments. It has something to do with their silence and gravity, and with the fact that one cannot help them. Their legs somehow seem exposed, so that it was at once incredible and terribly clear that their legs are all they have to hold them up. I had not wanted to go to the casket myself, and I certainly had not wished to be led there, but there was no way of avoiding either of these forms. One of the deacons led me up, and I looked at my father's face. I cannot say that it looked like him at all. His blackness had been equivocated by powder, and there was no suggestion in that casket of what his power had or could have been. He was simply an old man dead, and it was hard to believe that he had ever given anyone either joy or pain. Yet his life filled that room. Further up the avenue, his wife was holding his newborn child. Life and death so close together, and love and hatred, and right and wrong, said something to me which I did not want to hear concerning man, concerning the life of man. After the funeral, while I was downtown desperately celebrating my birthday, that's a wonderful line, right? After my funeral, while I was downtown desperately celebrating my birthday. This is the kind of stuff that if you want to be a writer, this is supposed to stick in your head. You're supposed to pay attention to this kind of shit. A Negro soldier in the lobby of the Hotel Braddock got into a fight with a white policeman over a Negro girl. So this is the story of the riot, right? I've always said that race riots in America usually have started with some instance of police brutality. Negro girls, white policemen in or out of uniform, and Negro males in or out of uniform were part of the furniture of the lobby of the Hotel Braddock, and this was certainly not the first time such an incident had occurred. It was destined, however, to receive an unprecedented publicity, for the fight between the policeman and the soldier ended with the shooting of the soldier. Rumor, flowing immediately to the streets outside, stated that the soldier had been shot in the back, an instantaneous and revealing invention, and that the soldier had died protecting a Negro woman. The facts were somewhat different. For example, the soldier had not been shot in the back and was not dead, and the girl seems to have been as dubious a symbol of womanhood as her white counterpart in Georgia usually is. But no one was interested in the facts. They preferred the invention because this invention expressed and corroborated their hates and fears so perfectly. Right? We see this in anything, right? In everything. It is just as well to remember that people are always doing this. Ah, he's saying, I didn't even have to say that. Perhaps many of those legends, including Christianity, to which the world clings and began their conquest of the world with just some such concerted surrender to distortion. The effect in Harlem of this particular legend was like the effect of a lit match in a tin of gasoline. The mob gathered before the doors of the Hotel Braddock simply began to swell and to spread in every direction, and Harlem exploded. The mob did not cross the ghetto lines. It would have been easy, for example, to have gone over Morningside Park on the west side, or to have crossed the Grand Central Railroad track at 125th Street on the east side to wreak havoc in white neighborhoods. The mob seems to have been mainly interested in something more potent and real than the white face, that is, in white power, and the principal damage done during the riot of the summer of 1943 was to white business establishments in Harlem. It might have been a far bloodier story, of course, if at the hour the riot began these establishments had still been open. From the Hotel Braddock, the mob fanned out, east and west along 125th Street, and for the entire length of Lenox 7th and 8th Avenues. Along each of these avenues and along each major side street, 116th, 25th, 35th, and so on, bars, stores, pawn shops, restaurants, and even little luncheonettes had been smashed open and entered and looted. Looted, it might be added, with more haste and efficiency. The shelves really looked as though a bomb had struck them. Cans of beans and soup and dog food, along with toilet paper, cornflakes, sardines, and milk tumbled every which way. And abandoned cash registers and cases of beer leaned crazily out of the splintered windows and were strewn along the avenues. Sheets, blankets, and clothing of every description formed a kind of path, as though people had dropped them while running. I truly had not realized that Harlem had so many stores until I saw them all smashed open. The first time the word wealth ever entered my mind in relation to Harlem was when I saw it scattered in the streets. But one's first incongruous impression of plenty was countered immediately by an impression of waste. None of this was doing anybody any good. It would have been better to have left the plate glass as it had been and the goods lying in the stores. It would have been better, but it would have also been intolerable, for Harlem had needed something to smash. To smash something is the ghetto's chronic need. Most of the time it is the members of the ghetto who smash each other and themselves. But as long as the ghetto walls are standing, there will always come a moment when these outlets do not work. That summer, for example, it was not enough to get into a fight on Lenox Avenue or curse out one's cronies in the barbershops. If ever indeed the violence which fills Harlem's churches, pool halls, and bars erupts outward in a more direct fashion, Harlem and its citizens are likely to vanish in an apocalyptic flood. That this is not likely to happen is due to a great many reasons, most hidden and powerful among them the Negro's real relation to the white American. This relation prohibits simply anything as uncomplicated and satisfactory as pure hatred. In order really to hate white people, one has to blot so much out of the mind and the heart that this hatred itself becomes an exhausting and self-destructive pose. But this does not mean, on the other hand, that love comes easily. The white world is too powerful, too complacent, too ready with gratuitous humiliation, and above all, too ignorant and too innocent for that. One is absolutely forced to make perpetual qualifications, and one's own reactions are canceling each other out. It is this, really, which has driven so many people mad, both black and white. One is always in the position of having to decide between amputation and gangrene. Amputation is swift, but time may prove that the amputation was not necessary, or one may delay the amputation too long. Gangrene is slow, but it is impossible to be sure that one is reading one's symptoms right. The idea of going through life as a cripple is more than one can bear, and equally unbearable is the risk of swelling up slowly in agony with poison. And the trouble, finally, is that the risks are real even if the choices do not exist. I wonder if Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter ever read James Baldwin. Probably not. But as for me and my house, my father had said, we will serve the Lord. I wonder, as we drove him to his resting place, what this line had meant for him. I had heard him preach it many times. I had preached it once myself, proudly giving it interpretation different from my father's. Now the whole thing came back to me, as though my father and I were on our way to Sunday school and I were memorizing the golden text. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I suspected in these familiar lines a meaning which had never been there for me before. All of my father's texts and songs, which I had decided were meaningless, were arranged before me at his death like empty bottles, waiting to hold the meaning which life would give them for me. This was his legacy. Nothing has ever escaped. That bleakly memorable morning, I hated the unbelievable streets and the Negroes and whites who had equally made them that way. But I knew that it was folly, as my father would have said. This bitterness was folly. It was necessary to hold on to the things that mattered. The dead man mattered. The new life mattered. Blackness and whiteness did not matter. To believe that they did was to acquiesce in one's own destruction. Hatred, which could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated, and this was an immutable law. It began to seem that one would have to hold in the mind forever two ideas which seemed to be in opposition. The first idea was acceptance, the acceptance totally, without rancor, of life as it is and men as they are. In the light of this idea, it goes without saying that injustice is a commonplace. But this did not mean that one could be complacent, for the second idea was of equal power, that one must never in one's own life accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight them with all one's strength. This fight begins, however, in the heart, and it now had been laid to my charge to keep my own heart free of hatred and despair. This intimation made my heart heavy, and now that my father was irrecoverable, I wished that he had been beside me, so that I could have searched his face for the answers, which only the future would give me now. I think I'm going to leave it at that.